Happy Friday. It's time for another episode of the Iron and Anchor podcast. This week we have Pastor Rande Greene, a wonderful man that we all love and like and fills us with so much joy. And we're super excited to get to know him, to get to know kind of some of the things he's been going through recently in life. So tune in and have a listen. Hey, Pastor. How you doing?
Good, Paul. How are you?
I'm good.
Jake, how are you?
Doing well.
Good.
Thank you.
So I'm actually starting this episode now with a growling stomach because we were talking about pancakes, Swedish pancakes,
right.
and Bob Evans and syrup or no syrup on our pancakes.
Lots of butter.
Or butter. Yeah,
that's right.
Or butter. So, Pastor, I have been a member of FCF for about the last year now, and it's been a wonderful growth experience for me and my family, and to get to know the man you are and the person of God that we see teaching us and leading us has been awesome. I just want to know a little bit about what did it take to get you there? I know that your father was a pastor. Does that go back generationally? Like, was his father, or did it start with your father?
No, my father was the first in his family. He was raised in southeastern Kentucky. Mm-hmm. You'd take a two-lane road to a gravel road to a dirt road and go and drive through a creek to get to the place where he was.
Crick.
Yeah, crick. That's right. It's back in the holler.
Yeah.
So. No, he was raised unchurched. I think his mother was a believer, but was pretty isolated. They had a 3-room house and 11 kids, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah, and an outhouse.
Yeah.
So it was pretty primitive, and so. He left there. I think he probably had just a grade school education because all the boys worked the farm, And he left and went to Charleston, West Virginia, because his brother was supervising a feed store, and he got a job there, and that's where he became a Christian.
Okay.
He went to a revival service and heard there was an evangelist there named Alan Caton who was preaching, and my dad gave his life to the Lord.
How do you know how old he was?
He was probably around 20 years of age.
Okay.
It's the best I can remember. I'd have to ask my mother exactly. They were not married yet. Not too long after that, I believe they got married.
Okay.
But and my mom was raised a Christian. And then, of course, my dad became interested in her and decided to go to church with her, and that's where he met the Lord.
How many siblings do you have?
I have one.
Where do you fit in that?
I'm the eldest.
Okay.
And I have a sister who's 3 years younger than me,
okay,
who also attends our church, thankfully.
Yeah. So in your family, so your father became a Christian, your mother was a Christian, they got married. Were you raised in a Christian believing household? Were you taken to church? Were you participating in that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I grew up in a Christian home, and for much of my childhood, my dad was bivocational.
Yeah.
He worked at Hewitt Soap Company,
okay,
and founded the church, and started the church in a 2-car garage on Ringgold Street in Dayton, heated by a potbelly stove. And so they'd take me to church. And the church was started with my mom, my dad, myself, and one family, a lady that's still in our church.
Wow.
Ann Chapman.
Oh.
Wow.
Yeah, she started with my parents.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So you asked me about going to church. We went to church Tuesday night, Thursday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. We had church services that much.
In the garage?
In the garage. And then out of the garage at 333 Huffman Avenue.
Okay.
There's a little house that they turned into a church. And I drive by it every time I'm going to visit my son, Garrison.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I drive by
awesome.
333 Huffman. I look over there,
That's awesome.
and I remember descending those little wooden slat stairs down to a dirt floor basement where we had our Sunday school class.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And we, after that, I think in around 68, 69, something like that, this building we're in right now was built. And by itself, what is the foyer now, and then the auditorium was not there.
Do you know your father's motivation for starting his own church as opposed to like becoming a member of another church, or just the calling on him to be a pastor? Or
that's a curious question to me, because I just think he felt the Lord's call. I don't think it was anything outside of that. I don't know that he had, while I was growing up as a child and a young person, I don't know that he had any really super positive examples of a pastoral role.
yeah,
I don't know that he had that in his life. I think it was just purely God's call.
yeah. I think it's it's answering two calls. Like I hear it and think it's answering two calls at one time: a call to shepherd others, but also a call to shepherd his children and his family.
yeah, right.
And as a byproduct, you get this. You get FCF Dayton.
Well, I've been very blessed to have very good Christian, caring parents, and my dad was, he was a wonderful man, a good pastor. I could just tell he genuinely loved me, loved my sister, loved my mother, loved the church, and loved the work of God, and loved the Lord. He was a faithful man, and he did very well. I mean, his upbringing wasn't
Right.
something that would naturally produce somebody that you would think would be a good pastor. As I said, he didn't really have any role models that I know of.
Yeah.
And but he was a good man and a good pastor, and I'm really blessed to have had him as my father and my mother as my mother.
What was the first thing you were asked to do in the church as far as service?
Oh goodness, it's been a long time ago.
Well, you kind of felt the call at a young age, right?
Well, I was 13.
13. Yeah, that's what it was.
I had gone to a youth camp and had a dramatic encounter with God. And then a friend of mine that was in the youth camp, I grew to know a little bit better. He invited me to his house to spend the weekend at his house and go to church with him that weekend. And he lived in Columbus and went to a church in Columbus. And all week long, this thing had been gestating in me. And it just kind of culminated. It got stronger as the week went. The Lord dealing with my heart, and I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind what my calling was and what my vocation would be. And so I came home the following week, and I told my dad what I felt and what was happening to me. So he took me to a restaurant, and we were going to talk. We went to the Burger Chef. There was a Burger Chef on Airway. This is long gone. It's all Burger Chefs, I think, man. We're living in a post-Burger Chef world. But we went there, and we got a hamburger, and we went out to the car. And I never will forget this, man. I was 13. It was, 47 years ago. And we sat in the car. It was dark. It was night. And we sat in the car, and we talked. And I told my father that I felt like God was calling me to be a pastor. And he said, well, I've got some advice for you. And so he told me that one thing I would need to know and live by is that if I was going to be a pastor, that God is my source. People are not my source. So, place your faith in God for provision is the message. And then later on, we talked again, And I graduated from high school, and I'd already decided I was going to go off to a Bible college in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's where my dad had been for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
He was only able to stay 1 year because they were expecting me. So they didn't feel like they could go back and he could finish Bible college because of having a baby. Well, I decided to go to that same Bible college.
Mm-hmm.
Side note, that's where I met my wife. So I couldn't be happier about the choice of school. So
Absolutely.
That's right. Anyway, so I told him I was going to go to Bible college, and before I left, he sat me down and he said, now, a couple things you need to know. Sometimes, well, he remembered from his days in that particular Bible college, and I don't mean to besmirch that school because I don't want to do that, and it will remain nameless. But he said sometimes they major on the minors. So don't just learn in your life and in your ministry to not major on the minors.
You've also said one thing, I think, in to me, and then to people here that I think resonates the same messages is chew up the meat, spit out the bones.
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah, you listen to somebody, you join lives with someone, and you may not agree with everything they say, but you can not see eye to eye, but walk hand in hand with someone else.
Yeah.
And you can have disagreements with someone, but you could live life and work together. And I think our church kind of reveals that to a certain extent, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was raised in a Christian home. My parents loved the Lord, and I could tell it was their life. They wanted to please the Lord, and they wanted to serve the Lord, and wanted to do a work for God. And that had a really strong and heavy impact on my life.
How old were you when you preached your first sermon?
Wow. Well, we had a youth leader, and I was probably early teens, and we would have youth services, I think on Friday night, as best I can remember. And Jim and Chris Stevenson were the husband and wife's name. And so we showed up on a Friday night for a youth service, and Chris, his wife, Jim's wife, came to me and said, we're going to have you speak tonight. Yeah, like, just a few minutes before. And I guess that was my first attempt. And I imagine it was just horrific. I mean, they could have at least given me
A couple days.
Yeah, a couple days, but they sprang it on me, and I'm sure it was terrible. I'm sure it was disjointed and probably somewhat meaningless. But that would have been early teens, and then then I went off to Bible college at 17, and I wouldn't have preached between that because I was not as serious about my walk with God as I should have been through the last couple of years of high school. I probably didn't focus like I should have. Well, I know I should have. But anyway, I got out of Bible college and then, of course, came back to this church for a little while and did some preaching. And then we decided we were going to launch out into a traveling itinerant ministry. And I'd gotten some invitations to preach at different places. So we headed off to Tennessee, where there was a couple guys I knew that pastored churches. And so we went and stayed with them for a little while and would preach at their church and do ministry with them. And then some invitations came in to go different places, and we did that for 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So you asked me.
That's got to be a life of faith. I mean, just trusting that God has another place for you and another invitation coming down the road. At that point, where Tyler was he in the picture?
No, we didn't have kids until we settled down to reestablish a church in Delaware, Ohio.
Okay,
it had some unfortunate events take place, and then the pastor failed and left, and the church was without a pastor for at least a couple years. And I think there were a couple families left that were just keeping the building from freezing up. They were making the little $144 a month mortgage payment.
Wow.
And they kept the church building from going into foreclosure. And they kept the heat on so it wouldn't freeze up and so forth. They weren't really having church services, but they were just waiting for somebody. And Brenda and I heard about it, and so we decided to go and try to reestablish that church. And so we went. We were there for 8 years.
Oh, wow.
And to be honest with you, that was a more difficult time of learning to depend on the Lord than the previous 5 years.
Really?
Yeah. Because it was just, for me, it was incredibly difficult. I was working a full-time job at a print shop in Columbus, so I had an hour drive each way, and rush hour in Columbus is just terrible, man. So I had an hour drive each way, and so 40-hour week and then 10 hours driving, and then trying to plant a church. And we had Tyler just about a year and a half after we went to Delaware. So that's when, and then 3 years later we had Garrison. So that's where both my sons were born, in Delaware, where we were trying to establish that church. Yeah. So we stayed there for 8 years, and then we came back to Beaver Creek.
So one thing that for me that sets you apart as pastors that I've been under and been involved with and gone to churches about is that you are a shepherd. That word just to me personally and my family describes you and what you offer this church. What do you think maybe drew you into a greater understanding of what it means to be a shepherd? I know I would guess that, faith and having to rely on God, draws you to that. But the love of people, I actually, it was a couple of weeks ago, you were describing attributes of your father. And I told you after the service, man, everything you were saying, that's you. You were describing your father, but to me, it was you. I was hearing attributes and descriptions of you. Do you recognize things that maybe he has taught you, or shining examples of being a shepherd and caring for your quote unquote flock that he may have shown? Did you learn that by example, or did you learn that by just trial and error?
Yeah. Well, no, my dad, two things that really impacted me from my father was my father loved people and the work of God, and he also loved to read. My dad was an avid reader, and I think, that had an impact. But one of the things I think about being a shepherd, there are personality types that are more prone to want to be with people. There are some people that would rather be alone than be with other people. That's not me. If I'm by myself, I'm thinking, man, who can I call?
Who wants to hang?
Yeah, somebody want to go out to eat or something. And so I think there's personality types that just draw energy from being with other people. Even when I've had some periods of health issues, and there have been times that I've come to church when I was not in good shape physically, and I find myself just drawing strength and energy from being with people. And there's some people that their personality type is when they're with other people, it drains them of strength. You know, I don't know. It's just how God made me. I draw energy from being with people. And so I think, learning from my father, definitely. My dad was a good man. He was a good pastor. And learning from him, and then also just having a personality type that where you would draw energy and want to be around people.
Do you know about the Enneagrams?
I do. I'm a 2.
You're a 2.
I'm a 2.
I don't know what a 2 is.
Here we go.
I'm a 4.
Ask all their wives because they know all the numbers.
What are you, Jake?
I think it said like a 9 or something.
Yeah, I'm a 4. Lisa's, I think, a 1. So I don't remember what a 2 is.
Yeah.
But I definitely don't draw my energy from being around people. Like that saps my energy, but I draw my energy from being alone.
Well, I would have never thought that.
Well, see, I think there's also when you become involved in the right community, I think that some of those things can change. Like being involved in this community here at SCF and the people that we're seeing on a daily basis. My motivations have changed. My motivations have. We were talking with Don Reinert in last week's or 2 weeks ago episode that loving your neighbor and loving others is the outpouring of God's love for us, and I've experienced this motivation change of, man, I want to be with them and I want to experience the things that they have to offer my life and to write into my life because of God's love and what He's done for me. So I think, I prefer to be alone sometimes, but again, motivations change and it's been a great experience for us. So I've already said you're a shepherd. You care about the people in your church in a way that is just so evident, and the people know that without a doubt. Let's talk a little bit about your medical stuff, because we're skipping a huge chunk of your life. You're a pastor in Delaware, Ohio. You come back to Dayton, Ohio, and you actually start pastoring this church from your father, right?
Yeah. Well, we came back in January, and then we were co-pastoring. And my father was senior pastor, and I was co-pastoring with him. And then in August of that same year, he and I were on a Monday at the golf course. We were golfing together, and he suffered a stroke. And it was a massive stroke. And I think he lost initially in that first stroke, he had 45% of his brain tissue. So, we didn't know if he was going to live or not. The third or fourth day, the brain is swelling, and we didn't know if he was going to make it. But fortunately, he did, and he lived for another decade. My mother took just splendid care of him, and he was able to live after a massive stroke. Living for over a decade is pretty exceptional.
Yeah.
So we waited a long while, 2 or 3 years, before we had the church vote on us.
Gotcha.
And it was unanimous because we had been pastoring. And so I felt like, God didn't foreordain it, but God foreknew it. And He brought us back when He did, because I think He cared for the church.
How long have you been pastoring FCF now?
Well, officially the pastor since 95.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a good long while.
It is. I'm old.
And I am willing to bet that the people I see on a Sunday have been here for about the same amount of time.
Some of them.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, when the church was started in the 2-car garage, there was a lady there with her daughter, Ann, and her daughter, Selma. They were here last Sunday.
Yeah,
Man.
They still show up.
Yeah. And then other folks that, have been here. Well, okay, Ann, she was Ann Cooper then. She's Ann Chapman now. She was in the car with my parents when I was brought home from the hospital, a newborn. So, she's 89 years old.
Wow.
And has been just a consistent, committed, faithful part of the church, and has walked through a lot with us and in her own life. And then, of course, her daughter Selma, who's still in the church and part of it. And it's pretty remarkable.
So I'm going to move us to another point of your life is you start experiencing some medical difficulties.
Right.
Kind of explain where that came from, like what instigated that.
Okay. Well, back in 2010, obviously there was a massive earthquake in Haiti. And so myself and some of the men of the church decided that we would go there because I became aware of a ministry there, an orphanage, and we started supporting them, and they had significant damage in the earthquake. And so myself and some men of the church, some skilled men with regard to building, and then some of us who just would listen to what they said and do what we were told, we went to help try to rebuild some of the structures there at that orphanage. And so I contacted the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. Well, I got on their website, and then I actually made a phone call to them to find out what immunizations we should take before we went to Haiti. And man, they had a long list. And they said things like there were rabid bats flying around. It was just, it was. It ended up being nothing like they said it was going to be. Now, it was horrific.
Yeah.
But I never saw a rabid bat, not one time, thankfully. So I had all the immunizations. And toward the latter part of the trip being there, I started having double vision. And when I got back, it came on with a vengeance. I saw two of everything. And so I went to an optometrist, and she said, "It's not your eyes. There's something else wrong." So she recommended me to a doctor, and he informed me that he thought I had a brain tumor. He was a great bedside manner.
Yeah.
And that's a story in itself. But then he referred me to a neuro-ophthalmologist. And so I went to that doctor, and he sent me for a blood draw to find out if it was indeed something called myasthenia gravis, and it was. It affected the optical nerve in my right eye, optical nerve number 5 or 6, I can't remember, which affected my vision laterally right in my right eye. So I couldn't track with my right eye. And so I was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, which is an autoimmune disorder. It affects voluntary muscles. Your immune system actually attacks voluntary muscles. And at that point, it was only attacking my right eye. In 2 to 2.5 years, it generalized and began to affect other muscles, swallowing, soft palate, speaking, and eventually my lungs. So I ended up in the hospital and Cleveland Clinic for a while, and they helped kind of get me righted with some immune suppressants. So that started a long odyssey, if you will, and that began in 2012, 2013. There were times I would be just incredibly weak because the autoimmune disorder can make you incredibly fatigued and weak, generally weak, not just in those voluntary muscles. And so it's been kind of an odyssey, if you will. And then last year, when I was in Cleveland Clinic, and I'll expedite this, when I was in Cleveland Clinic, they were doing an MRI, and they found a tiny little cyst on the tail of my pancreas. They wanted to just watch it, and that was 2014 when they found that. So in November 1 of 2018, a doc said, "It has grown. I think we should take it out." He left the decision to me. So I was referred to Ohio State University for a robotic surgery to take that little cyst off. And
that didn't go so well.
That didn't go as planned. They were not able to do it robotically, even though the doctor, who was a really good doctor and a very good man, tried for 2 hours to do it robotically and couldn't reach it. So we ended up cutting me from stem to stern and to take that out, and ended up taking out part of my pancreas as well and my spleen. And then that turned into a long 2.5-month ordeal where I was back in the hospital 3 more times after the initial stay.
In that time, 2.5 months, how many days did you spend in the hospital?
28.
28 days.
A month.
Yeah. And
I mean, that's the whole month of February.
it is. And in 2.5 months, I was in the pulpit 3 times here at the church, which really did profoundly affect me. I can't tell you how it made me feel to think that I was, failing, wasn't able to really make my commitment to God and my church family. And I felt a real sense of failure. And it wasn't constant the whole time, but it would come in waves, and coming in waves mainly when I was in the hospital, kind of isolated.
Yeah.
And I had some dark moments. I really did. But the Lord always, every time when I would call on the Lord, he would prove to be faithful and would comfort me with his Spirit.
Yeah.
And I actually, during that 2.5 months to almost 3 months, I believe with all my heart, I drew closer to the Lord than any 3-month period in my whole life. And that's saying something.
So for someone who pours himself out as a shepherd that gives to the church, I mean, you live literally, right down the
700
street.
feet.
Yeah, 700 feet from the church. I mean,
Which is a blessing to us.
Absolutely. And you're here every time the doors are open. You actually open you probably open the doors.
Well, not on Sunday mornings. There are people that beat me here, and Jake's one
Hey,
of them.
That's true. But what is it for you as a shepherd? What does it take, or is it easy, or is it something that you can do willingly, or do you have to kind of be put in a place to accept it? What does it take for a shepherd to be shepherded, to be built up? Because I know that experiencing what you were going through on the outside, and as one of your quote unquote sheep, that was, I mean, there was prayer, there was constant checking in, it was that. What does it take, and what do you think? Because I think that there are other shepherds out there. There are other people that give themselves, to the church, that in times of crisis or need, they may not know, or may not know how to give themselves up to be shepherded.
Yeah. Well, one thing, it may not be the primary thing, but one thing that really, I think, sustains me is just reading. I don't know what I would be and what kind of shape I would be in if I couldn't read. For instance, in the hospital, I read books, and part of the time I was on pretty heavy pain medication, and I'd have to read a chapter 3 times to really absorb it. But during those stays, I read, and I would read things, and the Lord really directed me to books that I needed, that spoke to me. And you would think, wow, what a happy accident that you had that book at that time. But it was not a happy accident. It was the Lord's doing. So I read books. I read one book written by a scholar, The Transforming Power of Grace, that just spoke to me so profoundly. It impacted me as much as anything I've read, I believe, outside of the scriptures themselves. Sure. But it was heavily scriptured. So it was the scriptures and principles drawn from the scriptures that just heavily impacted me, sustained me. I read a book, The Biography of the Life of Paul by N.T. Wright, and I began to identify with Paul. Not that I, am anything like Paul as far as accomplishments or depth or intelligence or anything like that. I'm not equating myself with the Apostle Paul, but to know and see that somebody like Paul, somebody that brilliant, someone that accomplished, somebody that close to God, would go through difficulties, would suffer affliction. One place it says he despaired of life. If somebody were to come into my office and sit down and say, Pastor, I'm despairing of life, I'd be concerned.
Yeah.
and I'd try to help them and get them help. Paul despaired of life. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8, he despaired of life. Then another place it says that he rejoiced in afflictions, and one of the words he uses is insults. The man rejoiced in being insulted. Man, I'm not quite there. I'm not there. I find it hard if I'm insulted. And, the people of this church are wonderful. I know they love me, and I'm not suggesting that they insult me.
Not all the time.
Not intentionally. Not
service.
intentionally, yeah. But I saw that in Paul's life. And, man, it sustained me. The Lord, when the Lord speaks to your heart and it's a revelation, it comes with power.
Yeah.
It comes in a transformative way. It's not just a good idea. Hey, what do you know? It's not somebody just saying, that's brilliant. It's more than that.
Yeah. You say transformative. So for me, I know that there was experiences that I can look back and say, man, that was a hard thing to do, a hard thing to grow through. But God used it to move me to this other place. What do you think? I've talked with you a little bit about, moving from that time to now. What do you think God's transforming this into? Where do you think why did he choose that path, and where is he moving that to?
Well,
for you, I mean, I think as a byproduct, we will probably see fruit in our church. But for you, where as a pastor and as a shepherd, what does that? How did that affect you like that?
Well, the bottom line is this: I think the essence of the Christian life, if you distill everything down and you just get a single principle that is fundamental to the fruitfulness necessary in the Christian life, it's just learning to trust the Lord. And I honestly had to just say, Lord, I'm trusting you. I make the conscious, deliberate decision. I'm trusting you. I'm not at my church. Here I am laying in a hospital bed, and it's 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. I'm not there. I'm just trusting you that everything's going to be okay. And I think that was the Lord's doing. I mean, and then another thing, I read when I was reading about Paul and really poring over 2 Corinthians, because it's just a remarkable, life-changing letter to really study 2 Corinthians. And I want to go through it verse by verse sometime here at the church, but the verse 9 of chapter 1, where he talked about in verse 8, despairing of life, in verse 9, and I'm paraphrasing, he says something to the effect of, he says, this happened to us so that we would learn not to rely upon ourselves, but to rely upon God. That happened. The affliction he went through in Asia, which was evidently a long prison stay, where outside the prison, the church he founded in Corinth was turning against him. They had even, Paul was the founder of that church, and they said to Paul, if you're going to come back here, we think you're insane. We think you're out of your mind. If you're going to come back here, you're going to need a letter of recommendation. Paul wrote to him and said, you are my letter of recommendation. And he also said to them, if I'm out of my mind, it's for God's sake. If I'm in my right mind, it's for your sake. So he was responding to those accusations. Paul went through all of that, the affliction in Asia, the rejection of the church in Corinth, the church he founded and loved. He went through all of that. And he said the reason why? So that I would learn to rely on God and not on myself. I saw purpose. I saw purpose in what I faced. I'm not saying God caused a little tiny cyst on my pancreas, but he knew about it, and he knew how to use it. He knew how to make it effective for me. He knew how to give me beauty for ashes. And so the Lord was working in the midst of all of that. I suffered a lot of pain, a lot of nausea, a lot of just concern and worry. But everything that happened, God was trying to teach me and instruct me to learn to trust Him, not in anything that comes from human ingenuity or human ability. Nothing that we can do can equate to what trusting God can do.
Right. One thing also, after that, at the start of the year, you kind of put out for us at the church a new, lack of a better word, and it's not the right word, but mandate on Wednesdays. We're doing this thing on prayer. We're having our prayer meetings, once a month. And did that flow out of that time, or were you thinking about that beforehand? Because for me, it's been very pivotal and very fruitful and impactful. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, so much so.
Yeah.
And the verses, but if my people pray, did that come out of that? Because I feel like there is, and I've experienced this in other people around me when they have gone through something and God has given them revelation, and God has given them a turning point. There is a weight there. There is I mean, you see the power behind their momentum. And I feel that through this, in this prayer, call to prayer for our church to pray. Did that flow out of that? Did you experience, a time where you knew we were praying, or did you experience something in your prayer to God that said, this is the direction we need to go?
Well, yes, I feel like it was a product of saying, "Man, I really need to learn to more depend upon the Lord, to trust Him more, to grow in that trust." And of course, out of that, anybody that trusts the Lord is going to talk to Him.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to connect with Him. You're going to turn to Him. That's the thing. If you trust Him, you turn to Him. Turning to Him, one of the primary way we turn to Him is in talking to Him and in praying. So yeah, it was a product of the call to greater trust that I was feeling from God. And I think the prayer services that we've had on those first Wednesdays have shown a real serious impact. I mean, it's been very rich, very wonderful, very productive, I believe. And then out of that, of course, this call to fast. And I know that, Lent began, but and that typically is a type of fasting. But more than any time in my life, I feel this drivenness to not only fast and pray myself, but to call others to it and to call our church to it. And I believe that that God's initiating that.
Sure.
And I'm going to talk about that more in this next Sunday service when we gather together. God initiating and our response to God. And I think the fasting and the prayer is our response to what God has initiated in us. And so God initiated through this whole odyssey that I went through between this 2.5 and 3 months. God was initiating something in me. Now that I'm well, and now that I'm doing well and physically well and gaining strength and am able to carry on my life, what's my response? Am I going to get busy and forget about God? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And how am I not? What's the product of not forgetting about God? Fasting, praying.
Yeah. I think what I've experienced as, I think I use the word byproduct way too much, but as a byproduct of you and your situation is I can visually see a desire and a need for greater intimacy with God, even from my shepherd, my pastor, which is in turn, he's calling us, the church, to do that through prayer, do that through fasting, corporately, and that's been a great thing. That's been turning to God, becoming more intimate with God, praying with God. I think that's moving us, Pastor. I think that's there's momentum, and I don't think I'm the only one that feels it either. And I know the power behind that momentum, and it's just it's an awesome thing to be a part of. And it's I'm excited for what God's going to do in the future here at FCF, and I think Dayton as well. I don't think that there's an accident that we have people in our church involved with things like Dayton Women in the Word and this podcast and other types of things in other churches. I think that there's a momentum there.
I agree.
That ultimately we have to have the intimacy with the Father so that we can have that reliance on Him and that strength to serve. And people who know that most and who have to rely on that most are people like you, that are our pastor and our shepherd. So I thank you today. Jake, do you have anything you want to end on here?
For me, I think we should, with Pastor Bean here, we should plug FCF itself.
Absolutely.
Just because we have all kinds of different, for people listening, we have all kinds of different guests. It's not just people from FCF. But I'd like to, with having different, some people that we have on are, business owners, or they have their own ministry. But Pastor, I think we should definitely plug FCF Dayton.
Yeah.
Service times, you can go to fcfdayton.com. If you're looking for a church, Paul and I love it. Obviously we go here, so it's a little, And
ultimately, we want you to be involved in a church. We want you to be involved in a community that is loving and serving God and serving each other out of that love that God is giving you. But, here at FCF, we have found a love and a community and a pastor and a shepherd that is drawing us closer and building that love greater.
Exactly.
Let me say this.
Yes, sir.
I really appreciate you guys initiating this podcast and having taking the responsibility to minister in this way. I think it's a tremendous thing, and I'm grateful for it and for you guys and for what you're doing. And man, I'm praying that it blesses many people.
Absolutely. Amen. Yeah. So guys, again, fcfdayton.com. If you want to come visit us, we would love to have you. We have wonderful services, wonderful worship, wonderful teaching. The podcast, check us out on your favorite app. We're on Google Play, iTunes. I do Overcast. We're also on YouTube. Our friend Justin, he records these episodes on video, and they're wonderful if you want to watch that way. Again, check us out at ironandanchor.com. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks to Justin Mortar.
Absolutely. Hey guys, this is Paul from Iron and Anchor. If you're feeling led that you might want to be a part of the podcast, go to ironandanchor.com and to the Contact Us section. The form that we send out to people for the episodes, it's going to be on there. Fill it out and we'll be in touch. Thanks.